Welcome to another episode of the Long Bass Symphony's Speaking of the Arts. I'm music director Charles Evans. You know, one of the most fascinating aspects of living in this fast-growing community is the wide variety of people who've moved here and who continue to relocate to this area. I recently met an individual with close family ties to the great American composer Samuel Barber. I was intrigued by his stories and memorabilia and thought that you might be as well. So, enjoy this conversation with Samuel Barber's nephew, Chris Beatty. Hi, I'm in the home of a person I recently met. I had the pleasure of getting introduced to, Chris Beatty. And this is along the lines of the wonderful variety of great people you meet in a place like Myrtle Beach, where people are moving here, moving in and out. And I happened to run into him and be introduced, like I said, and the distinction was, this gentleman is Samuel Barber, the great American composer's nephew. And of course, that opened up all the possibilities, like, I'm sure you have stories and a great history. So, and those of you who are not real classical music buffs, Samuel Barber's name, I trust you would know. He's written a lot. He wrote a lot of great orchestral works and operas that were premiered at the Met. But of course, he's by far best known for the famous Adagio for Strings, which has been used in numbers of movies, everything from Platoon to Elephant Man, and it's just generally, it was used, I believe, at John F. Kennedy's funeral.
Yes.
So that is really the touch point for most everybody for Samuel Barber. But before we get into all of that and maybe some of the greater memorabilia that you've got, Chris, just tell us a little bit about yourself, starting from your interaction with Samuel Barber as a child.
Well, of course, my mother was Barber's sister, and they were very close. They were best friends, and so there would be a lot of interaction with him, speaking with him on the phone. He would come visit, but I only knew him as Uncle Sam. I didn't realize Samuel Barber, the composer. No, this is Uncle Sam, and he writes music. Well, that was fine with me, and it was a few years. Probably when I was getting into elementary school, into junior high, that I started to realize that he was really an exceptional composer. And then I got into high school, and I was a typical kid. I was interested in myself and climbing trees and doing that kind of a thing. And I had fun with music, but I wasn't pursuing music. Now, my mother was a voice teacher and a pianist. And I do remember, I think one of the first times that Uncle Sam came to visit, and I've moved over 30 times, I have to think now. I believe this was in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And he came to visit, and he was standing at the top of the stairs. I was at the bottom of the stairs, and he pretended to fall and opened up an accordion of music about 30 pages long, when you would just do these continuous sheets. And I thought that he was the funniest man in the world. And then I looked at this thing, and I thought, what is my uncle doing with 30 feet of these black scribbles, that I knew were music? And I think that's one of the first times that I realized there's something different going on here. And then later on, things like he would be at the White House with President and
That
Mrs.
should be an indicator right there.
A White House in Washington. I'm a kid. Who cares? But I started to realize, wait a minute, he's with President Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, and he's on these committees, and he just sent us a menu. All the kids got a menu from this event he was at. And so it was just, and the napkins from the White House and things that just were kind of set it apart. So I continued just to be me and sing in church and have fun with music, listen to my mother give voice lessons. And just as time went on, hearing nothing but classical music in the home, and a lot of Barber. And once I got control of the record player,
Yeah, I remember that.
You remember those?
Oh, yeah. Still have one.
Yep. And I started choosing the Barber over everybody else because to me it was like a film in my mind. His music is very film score to me, much of it. And I would be able to sit and close my eyes, and just these movies would start going in my head because it's that kind of music. And I was starting to put together the man and his music, which does make me want to read one thing, if I can.
Oh, sure.
If I can start
Is this the
with
famous
this.
quote? Oh, yes.
Yeah, this is.
Anyone who's done any research on Barber, in preparing for a performance, this is the one letter that's always quoted.
And I think the summary of this letter is Barber knew from childhood he was a composer. He didn't have to strive to be, that wasn't something he wanted to become. It's something that he was already. And then he had to figure out how that worked. So here he is at age 8. And our home was fairly formal, and certainly his home was more formal, where he was brought up with my mother. So he writes this to his mother, my grandmother. Dear Mother, I have written this to tell you my worrying secret. Now, don't cry when you read it, because it is neither yours nor my fault. This is at 8, writing with that grammar, right? I suppose I will have to tell it now without any nonsense. To begin with, I was not meant to be an athlete. I was meant to be a composer, and I will be, I'm sure. I'll ask you one more thing. Don't ask me to try and forget this unpleasant thing and go play football. Please. Sometimes I've been worrying about this so much that it makes me mad. Not very. Love, Sam Barber II. So, I mean, writing that at age 8, he was actually writing songs and scoring, writing manuscript when he was 6.
Right, and I seem to remember reading that he and your mother acted out or did an opera that he wrote.
Absolutely.
As a project.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's sort of like the Mendelssohn family, that same kind of thing.
Well, ironically, he had one of Mendelssohn's Steinways.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, yes. And the rest of the family, I mean, his parents were not particularly musical that I'm aware of. His father was a doctor, a medical doctor. His mother was the wife of a medical doctor and the mother of 2 children. I don't know what else she actually did.
But her sister.
But her sister was the very famous Louise Homer, who sang with Caruso. And this obviously impacted Uncle Sam.
Plus, her husband, Sidney, was basically a song composer.
Yes.
Primarily.
So he had all these influences.
Yeah, and again, there was a strong American influence. I think Sidney Homer studied with Chadwick and other earlier names in American composition when the country was sort of finding its own identity and not a European identity.
And one of the great things about being raised in Westchester, Pennsylvania, where Uncle Sam and my mother were born, and when your father is the president of the school board, is that when you have exhausted all local teachers and yet you needed some more, the president of the school board made a new law that in Westchester on Fridays, anybody who was exceptionally talented could go to Philadelphia for advanced training. How about that?
Which was only about an hour away, you said?
I think so, yeah. And so he would go and he could, I know this is when he was 13, and I believe at 13 he was playing the pipe organ at one of the big cathedrals in Philadelphia. So he was the organist as well as studying there. And then of course at 14 went to the Curtis Institute.
Well, yeah, and that was the inaugural year. I mean, that was really a period of American cultural greatness, and you really have a lot happening there. I mean, the starting of the Curtis Institute, which is still thriving today, was one of the premier music institutions in the country.
Mm-hmm.
He was right there in the opening class. He studied conducting with Fritz Reiner, and I mean, you know, and also a lot of vocal instruction. I can't remember. And his piano teacher, Vengerova.
Yes, yes, yep, yes. Yeah, so he was a composition, piano, voice, triple major at least.
Yeah.
And
he was there for 8 years. I mean, this also was, I think, in my view, harking back to or sort of emulating more of a European conservatory type thing. Because he went in as a 14-year-old and spent 8 years there.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like going in and getting a bachelor's degree in music. You know?
right, yes, yes. He was going to be fed everything he could take. And Mary Curtis Bach, Zimbalist, was there to let him be that protege. And
Yeah, that kind of philanthropy is we don't see that as much anymore. That was the sort of the old, I don't know what's the term for it. It's on the tip of my tongue. Like the railroad tycoons. You know, the tycoon has not got the right connotation.
Sure.
I'm trying to think of the more appropriate word for it, but these shapers of industry and so on,
Mm-hmm.
and they had the money, and it takes in a large part it takes that kind of vision and endowment to create great things,
Yes.
like orchestras and museums and schools.
Yeah,
So.
I'm going to take a little rabbit trail here, just so I don't forget it. Mary Curtis Bach, Zimbalist, Ephraim Zimbalist was a great violinist, and then Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. was a Hollywood TV actor.
Right.
77 Sunset Strip, I think, was his show.
Yeah.
But when Carol and I were in Florida, probably 8 or 10 years ago, somebody said, "Have you been to Bach Towers?" B-O-K. No, I said, "I've never heard of it." He said, "Well, you really need to go visit this place." And he said, "I think there's something to do with Samuel Barber there." I said, "What?" So we found this place out in the middle of some vineyards, and it's a huge bell tower, a very proper European bell tower. And so I decided to, and I shamelessly do this when I can, I decided to meet the director and use the name of my uncle to find out what this was really about. And he said, "Oh, we would love to have you come visit, and come back tomorrow, and I'm going to put out all the special music that has been written for us when the presidents would come visit. And one of them was a composition that your uncle wrote for the Bach Bell Tower."
Wow.
I had no idea.
What year was that?
Well, for me, it was just about 10 years ago. I don't know when.
I mean, then he
it would have been,
written that.
I don't know, 30s or 40s?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So this place has been around a while. So we went back, and they had a special room set out, the archives, and it was just amazing. They pulled out the signature pages of famous visitors, including my great aunt Louise Homer, Sidney Homer, of course Samuel Barber, Giancarlo Menotti, various presidents had signed in there, and the music score that Barber had written.
Wow.
And it was just fun. And then we got to go up into the tower and see these 2,000-pound bells and see the mechanics behind it. And I'm a bit of a composer. And so he said, "Would you like to sit and play something, one of your compositions, on this," what's the proper name for the...
Caroline?
The Caroline.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's all mechanical connections, of course, so you have to... And getting the timing working is quite something, but I'll do anything. And so here I am playing one of my pieces that is being heard for 40 acres around in this beautiful area. And all because Samuel Barber had written something for that.
Yeah.
Just, the life's connections are just wonderful.
Yeah, well, what strikes me about this all so much, too, is just the idea of an American cultural foundation. And I'm struck by, as we were talking earlier, I'm just amazed at how far the relationships go in a family tree and so on, because, also in the Homer family name is the famous artist Winslow Homer.
Yes.
And so that's all part of it. And then your middle name itself is Fulton.
Yes.
And that's Robert Fulton, who invented the steam engine.
Steam engine, and did work on the submarine, and did the first ferry boats back and forth from Staten Island to Manhattan.
So as you look at all these family relationships, I mean, it's all about building an American consciousness, both industrially and culturally.
Yeah.
And it reminds me somewhat of, I think of Charles Ives in that same sort of independent way, the New England sort of independence, and it's fascinating to see. But at any rate, I didn't want to interrupt. But so this brought you to the point where you're a musician yourself and a teacher, but in a very sort of unorthodox route.
Right. I'm a vocal coach, and I work with singers, voiceover actors. I've had university hospitals send people to me post-surgery because even though I'm not trained in voice therapy per se, I seem to have a knack for that. I just have an understanding, and I've studied voice, of course, and vocal pedagogy, but
you're focused on the how and why, and that's what helps even in that case.
And so many of the contemporary singers, whether they're doing pop music or kind of Broadway music, a lot of them have not been trained to understand their own voice. They know how to sing, but they don't understand the instrument, and then they get into trouble. And if you get into trouble, what do you do if you don't understand the instrument? Then that's kind of what I do. I evaluate, here's what's coming out of the voice, here's what I can see in the throat, here's what isn't resonating in the harmonics. And
a lot of pop singers have suffered from that. As a matter of fact, I even had a voice teacher years ago who had said something about Frank Sinatra having to go through a passage like that. He was such a natural singer, but then ended up having problems and had to rethink everything.
Yep.
So it's very common.
So, wisdom says, proper preparation prevents poor performance. And a lot of the record companies, they'd send people in and say, okay, we're going to be putting, $80,000 to $150,000 into this project. We'd like to know the artist isn't going to give out after a month on the road.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's exciting. And whether I work with a lot of worship leaders who are composers, but worship leaders today means everything from rock to Bach.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so it's so much fun for me. I love the voice.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, as you were going along the way as you're growing up, there must have been a really significant moment where you realized, oh, that's who my uncle is. Like, did somebody confront you with it? Did you read an article? What was the moment where you go, oh, okay, I knew he did something very special, but this is an icon of American culture.
I think I used to go to New York when I was in high school. In the summers, sometimes during vacations, I would go to New York City, and Uncle Sam would get me tickets to the Met, to New York Philharmonic, the most fun was the rehearsals, the Met rehearsals, Philharmonic rehearsals, and so and he was out in the country house, and he had a small apartment in the city, so I got to stay there, and it was awesome. So here's
what a treat!
Me alone in New York,
and
being able to experience and realize just how good these people are, and how studied they are, and that began to build, I think, the realization in me that this is the kind of excellence that Samuel Barber is and deals with.
And what years would those have been?
That would have been early 60s.
Okay, and that, in many ways, as we were talking about, that was sort of the end of, let's say, a neo-romantic era as far as music.
Yes.
And I think I remember, reading, who was that, Joan Pizer, who wrote that Bernstein biography.
Oh,
I don't know if you
yes.
remember.
Yes.
But that really brought to light a lot of the conflict between the more traditional music and this new wave. Either, there was of course the opposition between Stravinsky and the serialists, but there was just a lot of insistence on being more modern.
Yes.
And we were talking about that earlier, the fact that his Barber's first opera that he wrote for the Met. Now I'm blanking.
Was that the last?
Vanessa.
Vanessa was his first there. Yes.
Yeah. So that was
Yeah.
that was a big Metropolitan Opera debut.
Right.
Big success. And then he was commissioned in the '60s to write another one for the opening of the new Metropolitan Opera at Lincoln Center.
Yes.
And that was Antony and Cleopatra. And it was a flop.
It-
and
it-
for no reason except that the sensibilities had changed.
I think so. It had every opportunity. Zeffirelli, did the stage directing.
But yeah, that was faulted for a lot of its failure. And if you've seen any of the, he did 2 or 3 movies. I saw the
Yes.
Traviata he did as a movie, and Zeffirelli was kind of over the top with indulgence and floweriness. So it kind of got in the way.
It did. Musically, I have the score. I have the recording. I was there with Barber at an Antony and Cleopatra performance. I loved it. I love the music because I'm primarily about the music and the singing, and so I loved it. And I remember we arrived in a limousine. He came by the apartment, picked me up in a limousine. We went there, and then we left. And I could see he wasn't happy. He was kind of downhearted, and I was looking for the limousine, and he said, "Oh, you're looking for the limo?" He said, "No. After performances, it's too crowded here. We just hop on the subway." So he went one way. He was staying at a hotel. I went the other way to the apartment, but I could tell that I didn't understand it from a publicity point of view at all, but I could tell he wasn't happy with it. And then when I saw what happened to it, and I don't think he ever recovered from that.
So he was in his 50s by then, I guess, and having started composing at such an early age, it was a devastating thing to be rejected after really being part of that American mainstream, which really primarily was neo-romantic. I mean, Charles Ives was an exception to that. But I think, Chadwick and Griffiths and all of them, they're largely romantic, impressionistic. And that was his heart, and that was the music he wrote. And of course, it's played so often to this day. Although, we were talking about, and we've had the opportunity with the Long Bay Symphony to play the more obvious works. Of course, the Adagio for strings, School for Scandal Overture.
Isn't that wonderful?
It's so animated. It's beautiful.
Yes.
But also the first essay and the violin concerto. Those are the more obvious ones, but there are a lot of other works that were written somewhat later that, were winning the Pulitzer Prize. And I can't remember which concerto, either piano or cello concerto, had won that prize. But, he has a lot of substantive works out there, and unfortunately you don't get to hear them as much. I was mentioning to you that when I was at the Cleveland Institute as an undergraduate, we did the second performance of his third essay, which was just before he passed away. And it's just such a beautiful work, and lush, full orchestra music in that romantic tradition. But, things come in waves, and you can't have the world with the same sensibilities forever.
Right.
And so they'll condemn it, and then a few years later come back, and it all doubles back around after a while.
But it cuts deep to the heart of the creator. It just, he was a composer, and so that impacted just everything about his life. Were there any musical encounters that you had with him that were particularly funny? Actually, like doing music or talking about music. This wouldn't be so much a funny, but it was significant for me. I was in New York after my high school senior year, and I was just going to do some rehearsals and things. And I called him and I said, "Would you be willing to let me sing for you?"
And of course, he was a singer as well, trained much as a singer.
Yes,
And,
yes. And so I said, I want somebody to tell me yes or no, is this something I should jump into fully?
Well, he would know, wouldn't he?
And he would. And I was open to hear whatever. I just didn't want to waste time. If it wasn't, because I didn't know what it was going to take. So he sent in Alfredo and Liliana with the servants there. Italian. He usually had an Italian couple staying at the house to
Well, he spent a lot of time in Italy anyway.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and of course he spoke Italian, German, French, English, all fluently. So he sent his driver in. I get out there and was ushered into his studio, his composing studio, where he had the second Steinway in the house. And who was sitting there but Menotti. So now I'm being accompanied by Samuel Barber. and the rest of the...
Unfortunately, he's family, so you don't think you can... Then he can be Uncle Sam.
That's right, that's right.
But Menotti there also
But Menotti there also, yep. And so I sang my 2 or 3 pieces. I sang an Italian piece and something in English. And then I just stood there quietly. Because Barber was no nonsense. He wasn't. He had a very dry sense of humor. He was funny, but he wasn't to be funny with me, his young nephew. And so he's looking at Menotti. They're kind of, I don't know. I can't remember if they spoke a little Italian back and forth or not. And he said, and it might have been Menotti that said it. We think you should do it. And that means studying 12 months a year. You realize you don't just stop studying in the summer.
Yeah.
This means you jump in and you go for it. And it was one of the most exciting days of my life.
Yeah, I bet.
Because it gave me permission to pursue this. It didn't mean I had to make my living at it, though I wanted to, of course. Yeah. But it meant it was worth pursuing. Because there are things that you do because it's who you are, and there are things that you do to pay the bills. And we musicians know that they don't always overlap.
But it's so fortunate when they do.
Oh, it is so. I am so blessed. You are so blessed. Yeah, yeah. So that was a very exciting time for me.
Yeah.
I remember being at an audition in that same trip. He wanted me to come along and listen to this baritone. He was kind of new on the scene by the name of Cheryl Milnes, but he wasn't known yet.
Cheryl Milnes, yeah, what a great artist.
Yes, and so he was the. I don't remember who the others were. They were just in a very small rehearsal room, someplace, and he. I guess Uncle Sam wanted to just hear him sing. He'd heard about him and wanted to really hear him, and so we got done and he said, "Well, what did you think of Mr. Milnes?" Here I'm like 18, right? in all my wisdom. I said, I thought he was fantastic. His tone was rich, his diction was crisp, his pitch center was there for every note. I said, I thought he was just wonderful. So that, I certainly was not the deciding vote for anything, but he included me, in the process.
Yeah, very gracious man.
Yes, yes.
Well, we could go on forever, and unfortunately, maybe we'll have to do another episode like you were suggesting, but any parting anecdote or thought about Samuel Barber or music?
I guess I would have to say, for any musicians, beginning midlife crisis musically, be who you are. If you're a classical saxophonist and there isn't much repertoire for you, but that's who you are, be that.
Yeah.
And if you are a singer and you really want to be heard, it's not a matter of who you know, it's how well you know your instrument, how well you know your music theory, know your repertoire, dig into the instrument and the music and know about dynamics and phrasing, the things that make music come alive. Just be who you are.
Yeah. I was trying to think of a Schoenberg quote that related very much to Samuel Barber's youthful letter, but it's basically, great art doesn't come from desire. it comes from necessity. In other words, it's welling up inside you.
Yes.
And you have no choice, essentially, but to do what you are bound to do.
Yep.
Either perform or write. So
Yes.
it's a great theory and idea to keep with you. Admittedly, though, it's hard. It's an elusive statement because you can have to continually ask yourself, who am I really? What do I? And you find that out by very difficult trial and error. So it's not one of those. It's like one of those enigmatic answers. Some sage gives you, and
Yes.
and you I just want an easy answer. Well, unfortunately, it's not. But you have to,
Right.
It's been said so many ways. Follow your heart, or just realize who you are and stick with that. And Samuel Barber certainly did that.
Yes.
And has given us a great body of work, and I look forward, to exploring more. I mean, there are just various, been economic reasons lately, but as we get back into the ability to do large orchestra things, I mean, economic and health reasons, which are intertwined, unfortunately, in this business, because when things shut down, then everyone gets more conservative. But I'm very hopeful we're going to be back up to normal, shall we say,
Yes.
and at some point we can look at this whole experience of COVID in past and move forward. And I look forward to exploring more of Samuel Barber's music. There's still many pieces I don't know that well.
Wonderful.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Chris.
A
Thank
real
you
pleasure
so
to
much.
spend time with you.
I've been here with Chris Beatty in his lovely home, and he's been gracious enough to pull out some memorabilia. I'm sorry that you can't see all that he's provided, everything from a family tree to the family Bible, and it's just been fascinating. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing us talk about Samuel Barber and related things. Thank you. It's enlightening to get an up-close, personal perspective on a great artist like Samuel Barber. It brings you one step closer to understanding him as a regular human being. Look for another Speaking of the Arts episode in a couple of weeks, featuring more people and events in the regional arts scene. Until then, stay safe and keep listening.